morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from today. A very warm welcome to this virtual Speakers Corner showcase ahead of October's Black History Month. I'm Henry Bonsu, a television and radio broadcaster and journalist, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this event today. Now, as the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once keenly observed, we are not the makers of history, we are made by it. Only by knowing our history can we understand where we've come from, which in turn allows us to truly understand our present. By revealing and acknowledging our past, we can create a better future. Now, to Black History Month, it's a hugely important season that allows us all to recognize and celebrate just that. By honoring the struggles people of African heritage around the world have faced and overcome and still do, we share a deeper understanding of the successes and failures of the past, which is absolutely vital if we're going to grow and make progress and achieve genuine equality and inclusion. Now, Black History Month also gives us a great platform to go beyond stories of racism and injustice and spotlight the talents, achievements, and ambitions of people of African heritage from all walks of life. And I know Speakers Corner have a wealth of super talented speakers who would make fantastic contributions to your own Black History Month events. The theme this year is Time for Change, Action, Not Words. And frankly, it couldn't be more timely. Black people are often given the double burden of experiencing racism and discrimination and then being expected to fix it. So I genuinely hope that we can all come together and acknowledge that, yes, it really is time for change, and the time for weasel words is over. We have an exceptional lineup of speakers for you today, each of whom have compelling stories to share and unique perspectives to really bring Black History Month to life. Over the course of the next 60 or so minutes, we welcome a number of individuals. They are journalist and professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, Dr. Kehinde Andrews, broadcaster, writer, and academic Emma Dabiri, and campaigner, scholar, and like her father before her, a champion for social and political justice, Dr. Makaziwe Mandela. Now, if you have any questions during any of our speaker sessions this afternoon, please drop them in the Q&A tab, and we'll cover as many as we can during our panel discussion toward the end. And so to my first guest, Dr. Kehinde Andrews is a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, where his research has focused on resistance to racism and movements for social change. He has advised a number of corporations on equality, equity, and diversity issues, and he's the founder of the Harambee Organization of Black Unity. Kehinde is the first Black Studies professor in the UK and led the creation of Europe's first ever Black Studies program. Dr. Andrews, over to you.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction and happy to be here. I mean, I think this important context for that Black History Month, because it is the moment where you have an opportunity to come in and shed a bit of light on issues of racism and issues of structural injustice and issues of Black communities. And it is important, right? But it's also important when we do that in a way that is different. Right, I think Black History Month is important for lots of things, but it's also been quite criticized in terms of tokenism, in terms of do we just need a month, in terms of do we just do the same things again and again and again. And I think what happened in the summer of 2020, after the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter summer, showed that look, what we've been doing over the last at least 30 years, maybe 20 years, depending, hasn't really been working. Like we've been doing some things, we've been trying our best, but actually need to shift things, we need to make things different. We need to rethink, unthink in many ways, de-learn, unlearn, so we can learn anew. And I think that's actually really goes to the core of when we're saying it's time to change. What does that mean? And I think, you know, obviously I'm an academic, so I deal predominantly in ideas and thoughts, and then how does that then translate into action? And I think one of the things we need to trouble is actually this idea of diversity and inclusion itself, because it's become something which happens. Look, I get invited to diversity and inclusion talks all the time. I appreciate that. Don't get me wrong, but it's become something that's almost like a ritual that we do, and actually, just in doing those same rituals, we don't necessarily make things any better, right? And so I think the first thing to do is to step back and think, actually, are there different ways we can frame this as an issue? Frame this is what we're trying to do. Frame the mission, frame the purpose, frame the outcomes. And I say that, and I start with that kind of challenge, because I do think anytime we're talking about something like racism and time for change and time to do something differently, we do have to accept that this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation. Because if it's not an uncomfortable conversation, then it's not a worthwhile conversation. You can't discuss racism without being uncomfortable if you're discussing it properly. So that's kind of I would say that now, because like I said, it's going to make you uncomfortable, and that is the idea, right? Because once you have that discomfort, then you can start to change, start to think differently, start to build anew, if you like. And so this is why I kind of picked diversity and inclusion, and particularly want to pick on this idea of diversity, right? So diversity has become a buzzword, something we can do, something which, get more diverse people, a more diverse set of people into an institution, into a place, and that somehow is a measure of success. Well, I mean, just looking at the news recently, we now have an extremely diverse government, right? No white men in the 4 great offices of state. But I absolutely guarantee you this will not mean that it is an anti-racist government. It's a perfect example of diversity and anti-racism are certainly not the same thing, and often can be, diversity can often be the enemy of anti-racism if we're honest, right? The question is not what is the color of people who are in a particular institution or a particular place, particular workplace. The question is, how does that workplace function? What does it do? Does it change? Is it different because of the people in it? And if you look at what's really happened over the last 40 years, there has been this expectation that get a few black and brown people in a place, that will automatically change the way the place works, and then we'll be on some kind of progress. That's the worst way to deal with these issues. It simply doesn't work. There is no evidence that it works at all. What you have is a kind of tokenistic diversity. Now, I don't want to say you shouldn't have diversity. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, you do need to hire people who are different, who look different. It's really important. As a professor of Black Studies, certainly it's one of my missions and goals, working in one of the whitest institutions in the country. Higher education is terrible. I won't bore you with the statistics, but if you do want to ask, I could tell you it's not good. So obviously getting different people in is really important. But actually a better word than diversity to think about is representation. Like, just because someone is black, that does not mean they represent black people, right? And this is what you see with the government, right? If you have a selection of privately educated people coming into a space, they don't represent the majority of the people in the country. So representation is a better thing than diversity, because there's a lot of work, particularly in the States, where they say a lot of the approach to diversity is often any black will do, right? As long as there's somebody, you just get a body in, that's kind of tokenistic diversity. The representation makes you think about, the massively different migrant histories. It makes a huge difference, like how your family came into the country, the class differences that there are in different communities. There is huge differences between the experiences of Pakistani, Bangladeshi migrants, for example, as there are Indian migrants, massive differences. So to just say we get some brown people in and then it makes a difference would be incorrect, right? So when you're thinking about what do we do and how do we change, it can't just be we're going to have a diversity scheme where we recruit black people from Oxford. That isn't diversity, right? That's not helping. You have to be intersectional on these issues, thinking about, are we getting people from different class positions, different experiences, different backgrounds? Are we getting women in? Are we getting LGBTQ people in? Are we getting this is what diversity means, right? That represents the population. And when you start to think about that, that's a better way to think about diversity, certainly. And then also, oftentimes what we see with diversity is you tend to have more diversity at the bottom and then very little diversity at the top. So just to give you one of the terrible statistics about higher education, I am not only the only Black Studies professor in the UK, Europe actually, I am also one of only 150 Black professors in the UK, full stop. There are 150 Black professors, so few Black professors that we can't all get a plane together, because if there's an accident, then there's none of us left, right? So that's how few there are. So when we're talking about diversity, seniority really matters. You find at the top of these institutions, it isn't diverse at all. And that brings us on to the issue of inclusion. So diversity is not a bad thing, don't get me wrong, but it's a mistake to expect diversity to do the hard work, and then inclusion follows on from this. So if the question is, who are we including? And if we're not including a proper representative range of people, then that's obviously going to be a misstep. And more importantly than that, you have an issue of inclusion where there's internal processes. So I just did a piece of work actually with the TUC, Trade Union Congress, and I was a bit surprised that even in the TUC, which even in the trade union movement, which has an anti-racist mission, has a long history of struggle and protest, etc., the staff members there were saying the same exact things that our staff members in the university sector would say about how they're not listened to, about how they get microaggressions, about how they're not promoted, about the awful conditions they have to work in. In fact, one of not surprising because it resonated when I heard it. One of the things which came up a lot was how many of the staff in the trade union movement felt a relief during lockdown because they didn't have to go into work. And actually, work is a hostile environment. It's not going in. Just that by itself made them feel better. And that resonated with me because that's kind of how I feel. That's how I feel now. I'm actually in work at the minute, ironically. But those kind of things, which it's hard to explain, it's hard to capture. But if you're seeing it in the trade unions, you are definitely seeing it in other institutions that don't have that track record. So there is a question then of, well, if you get people in, and particularly if you get people in from different backgrounds, from working class backgrounds, comprehensive educated, etc., are you making it a place where people feel comfortable? And I think this is a place where most institutions are failing quite badly. But there's a bigger thing I want to focus on as well, because when we think about inclusion, it can't just be about how do we deal with the people that are in our institution. That's something it should be about. You should look after your workforce, obviously. But there's a bigger question about, well, how is the institution itself inclusive? Is it putting out a collective strategy which is anti-racist, which draws in communities? Any company is located in a place, it is located in communities, it has responsibility to those communities, especially major companies. And the question is, what have your practices changed? Have they altered? I won't name the company because but there was a company when I was doing a television show. It's called We Are Black and British. And we had this whole thing about diversity training. And we went and did diversity training at this company, very, very, very large company, for a day. And there was lots of things about internal and how we're doing and how we're making sure we're shifting, making our staff feel better, etc., etc. There's really a lot of focus on the internal. And then I was talking to somebody who worked there, and they said their job was they did care and custody. And I asked him what the custody aspect of the organization was, and it was home office detention, detention and deportation. Right. So it's fine. Look, to say, look, we in our place where we're detaining people and deporting them during the Windrush scandal, we did that politely and we did it with a good ethos. But actually, the actual practice of what you're doing is deeply problematic, right? And this is really important. It can't just be about the internal. It has to be about what are we actually doing? Is the organization shifting? And the same organization also did a lot of outsourcing with public sector workers. So many of the workers they employed were black low-paid women, cleaning staff, security staff, etc., who the whole outsourcing process is about cutting their wages and their working conditions. So it's kind of meaningless to have a diversity scheme in a place like that if you're not then going to say, well, actually, can we do something different ourselves? Who are we trying to include our broader communities, which we are part of? So I think this is what I always set the challenge out to people at the start of this, is that actually what we need is anti-racism. What we need is anti-racist practice. What we need is a commitment to really do things very differently. And diversity and inclusion doesn't do that. It doesn't capture that. It can be part of it, but we need to radically rethink what our goals are, what our aims are, and what our strategies are. And I will stop there.
Very much indeed. Thank you very much to Dr. Kehinde Andrews. You said a number of things that I'm sure we're going to build on, and I can see questions coming in already, which you'll get the chance to answer a little bit later on. It is intriguing what you said about being one of just 150 black professors in the UK. So yeah, you can't even fill a plane safely, which is interesting. And also this week, we had the inaugural international conference of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, twinned with Coventry University, and I moderated that. And many of these issues were discussed in some detail in that two-day conference. So thank you very much for the moment. Kehinde, we'll hear from you again a little bit later on in the hour. But now to our next guest, Emma Dabiri. She is an academic and a broadcaster who presents Britain's Lost Masterpieces on BBC4, as well as Virtually History on YouTube Originals. Her debut novel, Don't Touch My Hair, examines why black hair matters and how it can be viewed as a blueprint for decolonization. Her latest book is What White People Can Do Next, From Allyship to Coalition. She's also a teaching fellow in the Africa department at the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London. And let me say welcome to you, Emma.
Hi, how are you? you?
I'm in great form. Thank you very much indeed. It's a pretty heavy news week for lots of different reasons. But
Wow.
let's start off, indeed, with your initial thoughts on Black History Month, or Black History Season, as some people like to describe it, because they say our history should be for more than a month. What does it mean to you? And has your attitude toward it evolved over time?
Yeah, so first of all, I feel like there is, a fundamental, there's a fundamental flaw with the concept of Black History Month, in that it furthers the narrative that Black history exists in some sort of silo that is separate to world history, or indeed British history. So much of the history. My first degree is in history and African studies. I focused on West African history. So much of the history of West Africa is intimately interlinked with the history of England and with Britain, and it is almost when. Sorry, something's just happened on my.
You're getting pop-ups. Don't worry.
Yeah.
You can sidestep those.
There we go. When you think that Nigeria, for instance, where my my paternal ancestry comes from, is a country invented by the British in the late 1800s, and most of the English-speaking African countries are English colonial inventions. When you think of the numbers of people that the British, forcibly transported to the Americas, and the way in which that transformed those cultures that were created, those American and Caribbean colonies, were the beginning of modernity, and the wealth and the infrastructure that was created through that transatlantic world, was the wealth that fueled things like the Industrial Revolution, for instance. The interconnectivity between African history and Black history and English history, to not recognize that interconnectivity is for Britain to not fully engage with its own history. So my first point would be, it's not just Black history, it is English history, it is British history. Secondly, another thing that I think about Black History Month is, I think it's become increasingly light on the history, if I'm honest. The emphasis tends to be on, things like, for instance, even when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, one cannot really understand why we are where we are, and what has created a situation where we need to have these initiatives for diversity and inclusion. If you don't understand the history that has brought us to where we are, that has structured society in the way that it is currently shaped, then you're not going to fully really understand why these diversity and inclusion initiatives are even necessary, So I feel that Black History Month, is increasingly light on the history, and it's actually imperative that there is a greater understanding, not necessarily of Black history, but of British history and how it intersects with African history and with Black history. So that would be.
Well, you really touch on something very, very important, part of the zeitgeist, because we now have a government that at the very upper echelons is the most diverse in British history. Kehinde was saying a few minutes ago that 3 of the 4 great offices of state are held by people of African/Asian heritage. So we're talking about the Chancellor in Kwasi Kwarteng, we're talking about the Foreign Secretary in James Cleverly, we're talking about the Home Secretary of Suella Braverman, who is of Indian Mauritian heritage, I believe. And then slightly further down, but still a senior cabinet minister, we have Kemi Badenoch of Nigerian heritage, like you, International Trade Secretary. Now, I'm watching your experience, your expression as I say this. And each of them has at some point said, we shouldn't be cancelling our history. We shouldn't be caving into wokeism. We should recognize what's happened, but retain and explain Britain has a great history and great heritage. Stop trying to cancel it. How would you respond to that? Because we're now into the realm of contested space, particularly during this time of the year.
I mean, I don't even know how to respond to something so inane. Cancel history, like the language that they use is so juvenile and facile. Their obsession with kind of online slang, cancelling, and wokeism, which I don't even know if they could define. I would love them to define what wokeism is. Where we would be in agreement is, I absolutely think there needs to be there needs to be an honest reckoning with history. I think there needs to be like more historical engagement, not less. But I think that there's a fundamental inability, you know, it seems in this country to have an honest and robust reckoning or analysis, you know, conversation, awareness of the history of empire and what it means. And it's not about chastising anyone. Like, as I write in my second book, I'm saying, you know, no one should feel guilty for what their ancestors did. No one should feel guilty for these structures that we've all been born into. So you can't feel guilty for something that happened before you were born. However, you can take responsibility for what you do. And what you can do is have, like, yeah, an honest and like just a curriculum that really looked at what you know, British history is and includes would do the world of good. But with this, so for instance, I always think, you know, even the concept, the racial categories that we have now, this idea of like a white race existing and a black race existing, this is an idea that is invented by the English in colonial Barbados in the 17th century. Race is English, the invention of race, the invention of the idea of a black race and a white race. That's English history. Let's talk about English history. You know, it's codified into law in Barbados, and then it's codified into this concept of race that we still live with now. This architecture of race that we still live with now is first introduced in law, yeah, by the English in colonial Barbados, and from there it spreads all over the world. But yeah, that's English history. Let's engage with it. And in terms of the cabinet, the diversity of the cabinet, my goodness, in a way, I feel like it's a blessing in disguise, because representational politics we see from this cabinet that representational politics, first of all, don't necessarily like engage with class. So as Kehinde was saying, I believe all of these people, if not all of them, the vast majority of them, you know, will be privately educated, will be Oxbridge. So even though they may be from racialized minorities, they have class privileges and class interests, you know, with the ruling class. So we can't assume somebody's class interests, you know, because of their race. But furthermore, we can't even assume who somebody is aligned with or what their politics are, also because of their class, you know, because of their class or their race. So you can be a minoritized person and you can be fully committed to preserving and enshrining the interests of the elite and of the ruling class. And I feel that what this cabinet does so dramatically is to show that there's no way we can assume that there will be any interest or commitment to dealing with racism or classism just because of the racialized identities alone of the individuals. We have to.
So, but Emma, if for now, the senior people who are of color or minoritized in the governing party are, quotes, lost, as in they don't want to engage with this in terms that you or maybe Kehinde or others would consider helpful or useful. What about other parts of society who may be more willing to listen and maybe more willing to do the work without feeling guilty? For example, companies, big organizations, which are in it to do business, but they employ an awful lot of people and they have a huge impact on how we live and how we see the world. What might they how might they position themselves? Because, of course, we're all influenced by what government ministers say, but in the end, we are independent and free-thinking people. And so what would you say to people working with companies right now, listen to this, who might think, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying about the government, about politicians. We're business people. We want to be diverse. We want to be equitable. We want to be inclusive, but we want to listen to you. How do we make sure we don't go backwards?
Well, I think if companies, are to think about and identify what their core values are, and how initiatives that are more inclusive and less prone to exploit people from marginalized backgrounds, be that race and class, not necessarily even race or class, race and class, the way that those two things intersect. If they think about, even from just a strategic and success and profit motivated position, even if you were to take kind of anything like philanthropic out of it, the world has changed so much. Demographics have changed so much. What is influential has changed so much. What kind of consumers and the public want has changed so much. And if you have just a kind of a non-diverse you only have kind of non-diverse people in your company influencing the culture of the company. I don't think you're really going to be able to connect with consumers and audiences in the current world.
Yep.
But I also think, for me, issues of racial justice are actually not cannot be separated from the current environmental crisis that we are in the throes of. So again, it's about going back to the core values of the company, and how obviously it'll be different. It'll be very different depending on what the company is. There's not kind of one size fits all. It will be case by case specific. But thinking about ways in which the culture there can be responsive to the various crises that we are currently facing.
All right. Well, Emma, I'm going to stop you there. I know you've got a lot more to say, and hopefully we'll be able to allow you and give you the platform to do so through the Q&A, which will come very shortly. Let me invite all those people who've listened to you and to Kehinde thus far, and you feel you want to ask a question, please do so using the chat box, and we'll try and field as many of them as we can before the end of our hour. But on to our final speaker today, who is Dr. Makaziwe Mandela, the daughter of South Africa's first Black president, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. And Dr. Mandela, I'm pleased I hopefully said that right. You'll see I'm wearing a top which I bought in South Africa very recently, because it is part of the presidential company, I believe, was set up in 1994. So let me move on from that to say Dr. Mandela holds a master's degree in sociology, is a doctor of anthropology, and as a Fulbright scholar in the US, received the Fulbright Distinguished Fellowship Award. Makaziwe has enjoyed a full and varied career, holding leadership positions and directorships with companies and corporations across the world. A champion for social and political justice and women's empowerment, Dr. Mandela has been intimately involved in developing a substantial investment portfolio within Nozala, which is a women's investment group, and then using funds to uplift and empower women across South Africa. I could go on, but I sense you would rather hear from Dr. Mandela herself. Makaziwe, over to you.
Thank you. I think, look, I concur with the other two speakers who've spoken about the issue of diversity and inclusion. But I think that for me, the important thing is that as we talk about diversity and inclusion, we talk about systematic racism. These things in corporations, to be successful, have to be driven from the top. And leadership also listen to the staff at all sectors of the organization. But I think as we talk about these things and the fact that these inequalities, both in society and in the corporations, have been enhanced by the COVID, by all the crises that we have around us. We talk about environmental issues, we're talking about wars, food shortages, issues of food security. We have to understand that they're impacting more Black people than white people in society, and that women are more impacted by these crises that we face today. But we have to realize that the issue of racism, of diversity, of inclusion is not a new topic. These are issues that we've talked about, I think, for years or maybe centuries. And that it is important to find how can we move forward. And I think for me, the important thing is that corporations do not exist in isolation of the societies in which we exist. So it is important to understand that when employees come to an organization in the morning and they enter the gates of an organization, they don't stop being Black, Indian, Asian, being women, being disabled, being LGBTQ members. They come with that into the organization. And so organizations have got to embrace all of that diversity. But for me, I think the time has come for us not to tinker and to talk openly about racism as it happens in organization and in society. And for me, unless we fully engage with the histories of our countries in terms of the colonial past, in terms of how Black people were transported into the Americas or into the UK or into the Caribbean, we talk about the inequities that exist in South Africa and continue to exist even after the so-called independence, because we have not got rid of racism in South Africa. It just has manifested itself into a different form. I think understanding history and engaging with that history in organization, to me, is very, very imperative. Because if we do not understand our history, if we don't understand where we come from, we don't see where the opportunities are to correct that history, because that history still manifests itself in society and it manifests itself in our organization. And I do think that the issue of racism must be addressed squarely. I know it is a very emotive issue, people say so, but that's part of the history that we live with. And for me, this thing of using all of these nice words about inclusion, about people participating, basically inclusion is about allowing everybody access into every sector, equal access into education, equal access into opportunities to gain financial wealth, equal opportunities really to participate in every sector of society and even in organization. Because if we look at the McKinsey study that has been done recently, it shows that for women to achieve equity in organization, it's going to take them 150 years or to over 200 years to achieve that equity. So that means it's worse for Black people in terms of achieving that equity. But I think that when we look at the people, and I think you asked the question, what is the connection between the private sector, companies, and government? I think they work in tandem. If you see the people who set the agenda for the world through Davos or the Club of Rome, you'll see that governments are there with corporations setting the agenda for the world. And now everybody is talking about the great reset of Davos. But fortunately, they have realized whether they do something effective about it, they've realized that the great reset that they're talking about cannot happen unless they address fully and squarely the issue of systematic racism in society and in corporations. As I said, for me, change starts at the leadership level. And I think that leaders in organizations, if they don't understand the history of racism in their societies, I don't think that they can lead, in my view, very effectively. Because you can't lead something that you don't understand, you don't have a clue about. And to me, there's an imperative of creating change in society. And so if you ask, as I say, for me, the individual level is important. Corporations can talk about diversity and inclusion, but what happens at home? Because my dad taught us that charity begins at home. If what happens in your home is that you allow, what is the conversation that happens? Is the conversation that happens denigrating Black people or people who are different from you? Is the environment, the conversation, the communication in your home and neighborhood about inclusivity? What are you allowing your children to see, to view, to read? And so for me, the change actually begins there. Then it goes into the workplace environment. And I think for me, the issue of having a Black History Month, to me, is a misnomer. I think Black people exist in society on a daily basis. And their lived experience, they experience racism on a daily basis, not just in a particular month. And so when we talk about racism, it should be something that is talked upon on a daily basis and addressed on a daily basis. And it can't be because there's Black History Month, that's when we celebrate the achievements of Black people. The achievements of Black people have formed the basis of the economic growth of this society. So those achievements have to be celebrated all throughout the year, not just on Black History Month. And I think that we have to also encourage dialogue throughout the year, not just in Black History Month. And the training in terms of anti-racism, in terms of diversity, in terms of inclusion, has to occur continuously within organizations, because we know that if people go for training for 1 or 2 days or 3 days, they are bound to forget that if this is not reinforced. Repetition is key in terms of impressing in the minds of people what is the correct behavior. And I think for me, with those few words, I'd like to stop there and allow for questions.
Dr. Makiziwe Mandela, thank you very much for your very direct and honest appraisal of where we are now. Well, certainly in this country. And what about South Africa? Now, I presume, and I'm just hazarding because I don't know South Africa so well, is there a special season where people reflect on what has happened before and respect the great founding fathers and mothers of South Africa? Or is that embedded throughout the curriculum in schools and universities, etc.? How does that work?
I think I'll be very honest with you that we don't have a particular month that celebrates, let's say the independence of South Africa. But there are events like there's Freedom Day where people celebrate the freedom of South Africa. But when it comes to the educational curriculum, I think South Africa has lagged behind other African countries in terms of changing our educational curriculum in this country. Because you'll find that even today, our children are spending more time in learning Afrikaans than actually focusing on what I would say the critical subjects of maths, of science. And so we are still lagging behind in other issues. We have not addressed all the issues of the apartheid era.
Okay, thank you very much for the moment. Well, a number of questions have come in, and we may have time to answer those and indeed some more. So if you're tuning in and you're thinking, well, do I need to ask a question? Is my question smart? Is it sensible? Don't worry about that. Just ask your question because we're here for that, okay? You may have thoughts about the composition of a workplace, the right way of approaching a particular subject, a sensitivity at work, or even how you become not just an ally, but also an accomplice, as somebody described it during the conference I attended at Coventry this week. Okay, so the first question is coming from Mohammed Musa, and he asks this: how do we call out unrecognized biases in the workplace without being labeled too sensitive? I'm going to put that initially to you, Dr. Kehinde Andrews. So, I watched that program on BBC Two that you were in, about being Black and British and the diversity of opinion. It got quite hot as well, and tears were shed And there was a lot of sensitivity. So let me put that to you. Mohammed Musa's question: how do we call out unrecognized biases without being labeled too sensitive?
I mean, I think it's important. There's a term we use in academia, microaggressions, where, you know, it is like the paper cuts of racism. But actually, like, having talked to people and having experienced these, I do think it's important we recognize that these are not microaggressions. Like, if, as I was saying before with the TUC research, people actually didn't want to go back into the office. They were saying that just being in that space was traumatizing. It was giving them straight. And if you look at the actual evidence on this, suggests that Black people in these kind of environments are more likely to have heart problems, and more likely to get ill and physically ill, right? So, I mean, Emma wrote a great book actually called Don't Touch My Hair. Yeah. And that's a perfect example where that's not little, right? Actually violating somebody's space and fawning over people. That's not a small thing, that's a big thing. And so we have to be confident to say, actually, no, these aren't little things. These aren't things which we can just pass off. These are actually really important things that need to stop so that we can feel that we actually belong in this and it not just be a constant hostile environment.
But in a practical day-to-day sense, Emma, so people who go into the workplace, it might be a hostile environment, or it might be, on the whole, a fairly pleasant environment most of the time. And say you're a woman of African heritage and you have a beautiful tresses, beautiful hair, and then your colleagues, European heritage maybe, want to touch your hair. They don't mean anything by it. And you like those people, you have lunch with them. How do you then respond to one of your colleagues touching your hair, quotes, innocently, without them then saying, oh, she's aggressive, she's so sensitive, you can't say anything to her? What does your book recommend?
The book, it doesn't have like necessarily a recommendation for that specific scenario. Yeah. The hope is just that anyone that would read the book would feel wouldn't do something like that, because they would have become educated on the significance and meaning of Black hair. But I will say, in answer to that, like, so for the person who's doing the touching, for them, it might be the first time. So when I was growing up in Ireland in the 1980s, I was the first Black person that many people had ever seen in real life. I know that because there were very few Black people in the country, and many people shared this with me. So they were very fascinated. So for them, it was the first time. But for me, it was constant, you know? So having an awareness that while you're doing this you're approaching somebody in this way, you're invading somebody's space in this way, but they are potentially, you know, putting up with that as as almost a defining characteristic of their life, you know? So it's like, it was like I would snap, I'd get really angry over something that, you know, it's like, what was that? But this is like, you know, kind of was a defining feature of my life. And even when I say I would snap, I'd just be like, no, that's not even really, no, you can't. And then reactions like, oh my God, you're an incredibly rude individual. And to me, it's, I think it's really speaks volumes. I'll give this example. If I was going to touch somebody's dog, if I was going to pet somebody's dog, I would ask for permission before I touched the animal. So the fact that people will invade the space of like a complete stranger and feel entitled to touch their body, you know, I think speaks volumes. And I've done a little experiment where I've flipped it on its head, and you know, I've kind of gone up to a white person and just been like, oh my God, your hair is so weird. Like, how does it hang there like that? And then gone as though to touch it. And the reaction is, you know, kind of shock and horror. And I'm a woman. Imagine if I was a Black man, because lots of white men touch my hair as well. If I was a Black man doing that, would be another story again. So yeah, sometimes if you flip it, if you reverse the situation, you can see how inappropriate it is.
All right, thank you for that. Dr. Mandela Makaziwe, I've got a question from Michael here, who says, what can companies do or do better to achieve a workforce that is diverse in thought as well as appearance? And of course, it speaks to the example of the current British cabinet. Dr. Mandela.
Well, having a diverse group of people doesn't mean that you are actually inclusive and you have a company culture that embraces everybody that is in that company. I think that what companies have to do is that they've got to actually have an acid test for themselves whether that culture that exists in the company embraces everybody. And to do that, they have to engage with the employees at every level to find whether they're comfortable to work in that company. And the other things that companies can do is that these days, as I say, they're not working in isolation. Their customer base is one of the areas that they can test in terms of how they're viewed outside, not just inside their companies. And those things, to me, go a long way in terms of promoting a culture of inclusivity and participation at the corporate level.
Okay, a quick follow-up on this, and again, it's within the corporate space, and this is to you, Dr. Mandela. Without trying to have tokenism or hit quotas, is there an optimal percentage of different diverse groups within a company? Would a fully Black or female company also be a negative, for example? This is from an anonymous attendee.
No, I mean, I think a lot of women who have not, who have found the corporate sector stifling, where there's no room to grow, have gone out and created their own female companies. And I think that a lot of women have done it, especially after the COVID. A lot of women have not gone back to the corporate sector because they felt burnout, and they are not prepared to deal really with the microaggressions that are happening. And they've gone out to set up their companies. So it's not counterproductive. I think it's a good thing that women can go and create wealth, because corporations are about what? About creating wealth. And if we can find other alternative routes of creating wealth, kudos for the women and for Blacks who can do that. Because I firmly believe that we are not going to turn around the social inequities that exist in society unless we as Black people are able to create companies that create wealth, we own wealth equally as our white counterparts, and women also are actually creating wealth for themselves.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Dr. Andrews, Kehinde, this is anonymous again. In my profession, I found that there is a significant emphasis on BAME, and that Black people seem to get lost within the statistics. The people at the top seem to think we are doing well on the basis that on the whole, considering all ethnicities, there is a good mix. However, there are very, very few Black colleagues. For example, I'm the only Black employee in one team of 100. How do you recommend we approach this issue? That's from Anonymous.
Yeah, it is a massive problem. That is kind of that any Black will do, and it doesn't really matter, right? And lots of people push back on BAME, because within BAME, you're talking about the majority of the world, right? Like, we often forget this. Most people in the world are not white, right? And so if you're just saying, look, we got some non-white people, and then you also forget that actually anti-Black racism is a very specific feature of the way that the West works. So you often find that in that BAME, and I can give you lots of examples, I won't bore you with them all, you often find that Black people do get missed out. And so look, one of the things that we've done very clearly is why we actually started Black Studies, because this happened in higher education all the time. That Black would just be everybody. And then we had to point out, actually, no, let's actually look at Black and let's see what the actual stats are. And it's horrendous. Like I said, 150 Black professors, about 1% of all academic staff. It is something you have to push back very clearly. The data is often there, in the UK at least, and you have to be very clear about this, because yeah, that one group approach, we're not all the same. There's massive differences within all of those groups, and they have to be understood if we're going to have a serious conversation.
All right, thank you very much indeed. This is from Andrew Moore. Emma, I'm going to put this one to you. Unless you understand how the culture of the environment works, you may end up wasting your time. If you believe that the culture is something that organization is, then you can initiate change from within by behaviors and dialogue. If you believe that the target culture is something that it has, as opposed to is, then any change will need to be driven from the top. So what, in your view, is the best way to determine good or bad cultures? And then Andrew ends up by saying, all lives matter, not just Black lives. Emma.
I'm sorry, I don't really understand the question.
Well, let's, I suppose, focus on the final part of the question. So what is your view? What, in your view, is the best way to determine whether an organization or an entity has a good or a bad culture? And then he ends by saying, all lives matter, not just Black lives.
So I don't see the correlation between the two statements. so it's a little bit difficult to address.
Yeah. I suppose it's about, let's say there's any organization, even a cabinet or a political party. If you want to change it, you have to understand it, understand why people have come to their bouquet of ideas. So, for example, if it was a Conservative Party, it's freedom of the individual, isn't it? It's strong defense. It's free enterprise, not too many rules, low taxation. And so, if you want to embrace diversity, inclusion, equity within that organization, you have to do it within the framework of those set ideas.
Okay, yeah. So if it's a fundamentally like if the kind of principles and the operating logic is exploitative generally, I guess it will be different. It will be difficult to create a non-exploitative environment within that culture. In terms of the last statement, all lives matter, lives matter, Black Lives Matter, whatever he said. Yeah, so I think as a basic starting point, we would acknowledge that all lives matter, but as I'm sure everybody listening is familiar with this argument, so I feel like I'm potentially just rehashing already well-trammeled ground, but the specificity of Black Lives Matter arose from the fact that it was people racialized as Black who were being killed by the police. So it was in response to a very specific phenomenon that was affecting Black people. So it was because a message, not only a message, there was a system in place which had been in place since before the inception of that country. It was in reference to what was happening in America with police brutality. I mean, the country was built upon the foundation of Black lives not mattering, of Black people legislatively like not being fully human. And that kind of carried on through to the current day in multiple ways. But most, I guess, most relevantly to the phrase Black Lives Matter was to do with the killings of Black people specifically by the police. So it's in reference to that. But yes, more broadly, of course, all life. I would go as far as say all life, not just lives, all life matters, the human and the non-human. But this is with specificity, to brutality.
Emma, thank you very much for navigating your way through that. Another one, let's have a look. This is from Andrew Moore again. And let me put that to Makaziwe, Dr. Mandela. Andrew says, change starts with dialogue. Not sure if you are all aware of crucial conversations, but the model is very good and it works if the organization is open to learning. Dr. Mandela, crucial conversations. There is tools for talking when stakes are high.
I think, in an organization, it depends. We all have a choice when you join an organization, whether you're joining an organization at the board level or to speak up. The issue is to speak up and not to be shy to speak up. And I think just in terms of your last question of what can people do to actually start those conversations? I've had experiences in a lot of multinational companies, and that you've got to understand the culture to be able to change a population, to know where your point of entry is. And in one of the multinationals that I worked in as a board member, we knew that the trajectory to senior positions really was to get experience across the globe. And that's what we demanded from that organization, that African candidates who were there actually had to be exposed overseas and be placed in different sectors of the organization to gain the experience. Because without that wide experience, you were not up for promotion or for growth to senior position. And so that's what we need to do. Yes, dialogue is important, but one has to understand that when you are dealing with issues of systematic racism in organizations, sometimes it's about taking the risk. Yeah. And you have to say to yourself as an individual, Am I willing to take the risk to open the dialogue, you know, especially with senior members of management? And what is it going to take? Because I personally don't believe that you can stay in a place that continues to be racist and exploitative and discriminatory in its practices. You have at some point decide if this organization is not going to change despite everything that I'm giving it, then it's time for me to leave and look for another job. I know it's easier said than done, but from my experience is that if we as Black people don't make these hard choices and sacrifices, nothing else will change. The status quo will remain.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Mandela. And, you know, people, that was a fantastic and energetic and stimulating conversation. Let me thank all our speakers, Emma, Kehinde, and Makaziwe, for making this such a wonderful session. There'll be a highlights reel of today's event for you to rewatch at your convenience and share within your networks. And a reminder that Speakers Corner have a wealth of supremely talented speakers who can really bring your own Black History Month events to life. And as we have today, really champion this year's theme of time for change, action, not words. Because we, each and every one of us, needs to do whatever it takes to ensure the same opportunities are available to and afforded to our colleagues of African heritage and friends. We must adopt policies and practices that are inclusive, not exclusive. And we must embrace the notion that structural and institutional racism isn't the figment of Black people's imagination. And we must create an environment, indeed a society, where Black people are accepted, included, encouraged, and where we're given an equal chance to thrive with equity. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Dr. Martin Luther King once said that the arc of history bends towards justice, the moral arc. Well, let's see. Thank you for joining us. Speak again soon, and goodbye till next time.